She cleaned his floors, served his food, and bowed her head every day, while he never once learned her name. But when a routine blood test exposed a truth buried for decades, the man who thought she was just a maid realized he had destroyed his own life. Stay till the end. This story changes everything. Amora woke up every morning before the sun, not because she wanted to, but because life had trained her that survival favored the unseen, and by 5:10 a.m. she was already on her feet inside the Kingsley mansion in Ikoyi, tying her faded uniform and moving quietly so no one would accuse her of making noise, a habit she learned early because in that house silence was safer than presence. And though she had worked there for 3 years, the family barely knew her name. She was simply the maid, or sometimes that girl, someone who cleaned glass tables until they shined and scrubbed marble floors until her knees burned, and when visitors arrived she blended into the walls like furniture, never spoken to unless something was wrong. And even then it was never kindly, because people like Daniel Kingsley did not rise to the top by noticing people like Amora. And Daniel himself walked past her that morning talking loudly on the phone about contracts and deadlines and power, nearly colliding with her before snapping, "Watch where you're going," without lifting his eyes, and Amora apologized instinctively, stepping back with her head lowered, knowing better than to explain she had been there first, because explanations were wasted on people who had already decided your worth. And yet when night came and the mansion slept, Amora changed, sitting on a narrow bed in the staff quarters with an old medical textbook balanced on her knees, her handwriting neat and careful in a notebook, hidden beneath her mattress. And before she slept she touched the small silver locket she never removed, the one holding her mother's picture, a quiet reminder that she had once belonged somewhere else, to a life no one in that mansion would ever imagine. Daniel Kingsley believed deeply that people were only as valuable as what they could show to the world, and he wore his success like armor, reminding everyone that he was self-made and disciplined and above weakness, while his wife Beatrice mirrored that belief with sharp precision, treating status like oxygen and people beneath her like dust. And in their house hierarchy was law. Staff stayed invisible. Guests were treated like royalty. And any mistake became a public humiliation, which was why, when a luncheon went wrong and a glass slipped from Amora's hand and shattered softly on the marble floor, Daniel did not see an accident but an opportunity to assert control, raising his voice in front of his guests and demanding to know how difficult it was to do simple work. And Amora stood frozen as laughter followed from the table, her face burning as Beatrice added that some people were lucky to even be allowed inside such a house. And though Amora cleaned the mess quickly, her hands trembled, because what hurt wasn't the broken glass, but the reminder that no matter how hard she worked, she would always be something disposable. And later that night, as she washed her hands, she stared at her reflection and wondered quietly how a man who spoke so proudly of dignity could strip it so easily from another human being without even noticing. Everything began to change the afternoon Daniel collapsed during a meeting, clutching his chest as his vision blurred and voices around him turned distant. And by the time he woke up in the hospital, doctors were speaking in serious tones about a rare blood disorder that required careful monitoring and strict routines, sending shockwaves through the Kingsley household, because for the first time the man who controlled everything was vulnerable. And suddenly Amora was needed more often, asked to prepare special meals, track medications, and remain nearby in case of emergencies. And though Daniel barely acknowledged her presence, he began noticing small things, how she remembered instructions perfectly, how she remained calm under pressure, how she spoke clearly when explaining details to nurses. And still he brushed it off as coincidence, refusing to question the invisible wall he had built between himself and people like her, while Amora felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. Not hope, but fear. Because illness had a way of exposing truths people worked hardest to bury, and she sensed without understanding why that this sickness would pull buried parts of her life violently into the open, whether she was ready or not. The first crack in the wall came on a quiet afternoon when the house was unusually empty, and Amora was sent to clean Daniel's private study, a room staff rarely entered and only when instructed, because it held the things Daniel valued most: his documents, his awards, his past victories framed and polished. And as Amora dusted the shelves carefully, her eyes landed on a drawer that had been left slightly open, something small but unsettling about it, and when she pushed it closed, a photograph slipped out and fell face down on the rug, and as she bent to pick it up, her breath caught in her throat, because the woman in the photo looked like her, not vaguely or coincidentally, but unmistakably. The same eyes, the same gentle curve of the face, the same quiet strength in the expression, and beside her stood a much younger Daniel Kingsley with his arm around her waist, smiling in a way Amora had never seen him smile. and her hands began to shake as memories she had buried surged forward. Her mother Lydia sitting on a warm mattress at night telling stories about a man who promised the world and disappeared before dawn, a man whose name was never spoken but whose shadow followed him everywhere. And Amora felt the room spin as she realized this house was not just where she worked but where ghosts from her past had been living in plain sight. And when footsteps echoed down the hallway, she quickly returned the photograph to the drawer, her heart pounding, knowing she had just crossed a line she could never uncross, because once you see the truth you can't pretend blindness anymore. Beatrice Kingsley had built her life on control, and nothing unsettled her more than changes she didn't initiate. So when she noticed Daniel asking for Amora more frequently, not affectionately but attentively, something sharp stirred inside her, because attention itself was dangerous, and she began watching Amora the way predators watch prey, noting how she walked, how she spoke, how Daniel's eyes lingered a second longer than before. And Beatrice told herself it was irritation, nothing more, until she started asking questions, quietly at first, then deliberately asking other staff where Amora came from, how long she had been there, who recommended her, and the answers didn't satisfy her, because they were vague and inconsistent. And when Beatrice searched Amora's room one afternoon under the excuse of inspection, she found things that didn't fit the image she had accepted, books that were too advanced, notes written in careful academic language, certificates folded and hidden at the bottom of a box, and a silver locket clutched like something precious. And Beatrice felt anger sharpen into suspicion, because poor girls did not live like this, and servants did not hide intelligence unless they were hiding something else. And from that moment Beatrice decided Amora was not just a maid but a threat, though she had no idea yet what kind. That night Amora couldn't sleep, because fear is a way of dragging old memories to the surface, and she reached beneath her mattress and pulled out the one thing she had carried through every struggle, the letter her mother had written shortly before she died, the letter Amora had read so many times she knew every word by heart, yet still read again when the world felt unstable. And in it Lydia spoke softly of regret and sacrifice and a love that failed her, explaining that Amora's father was a powerful man who chose ambition over responsibility, a man who would never acknowledge them because doing so would ruin the life he had built. And though the letter never mentioned a name, it spoke of luxury houses, political friends, and a wedding announcement that broke Lydia's heart. And as Amora reread those lines, her chest tightened because everything matched: the timing, the silence, the man in the photograph, the cruelty she endured without knowing why fate had brought her here, and for the first time she allowed herself to ask a question she had avoided her entire life, not whether Daniel Kingsley was her father, but what it meant that she had been cleaning his house, serving his food, bowing her head to his wife, while carrying his blood without either of them knowing. And the realization didn't fill her with anger as much as grief, because all at once she understood that her life of invisibility wasn't random. It was a consequence of a choice made long before she was born. The request for blood donations came quietly at first, framed as a precaution rather than an emergency, because doctors were careful with men like Daniel Kingsley, men whose influence reached far beyond hospital walls, and they explained that his condition was rare, unpredictable, and dangerous if not managed carefully, that compatibility would improve his chances if transfusions became necessary. And naturally, the first tests were done on Beatrice and then on extended family members who arrived looking worried and uncomfortable, but one by one the results came back negative, unsuitable, incompatible, and the tension thickened with each failed attempt until the doctors began looking beyond family and toward the staff, a suggestion that unsettled Beatrice deeply because it blurred lines she believed she'd never touch, and Amora heard about it while standing in the corridor holding a tray of untouched food, her stomach tightening as if something inside her already knew what was coming. And when a nurse asked politely if she would be willing to help, she nodded without hesitation, because saying no had never been an option in her life. And as her blood was drawn, she felt a strange calm settle over her, a quiet certainty she couldn't explain. And hours later, when the doctor returned with widened eyes and a careful tone, the world seemed to pause, because Amora's blood was not just compatible but an almost perfect match, rare in ways that made medical professionals exchange looks they didn't intend anyone to notice, and Daniel stared at her for the first time not as a maid but as an anomaly, a coincidence that unsettled him, while Beatrice's face hardened with something darker than shock, because this was no longer inconvenience but intrusion, and as Amora returned to her duties with trembling hands she felt the walls closing in, realizing that blood had a way of speaking truths people spent their lives running from. The doctors tried to explain it gently, using careful language about probabilities and medical protocols, saying that while rare matches could occur outside family lines, it was unusual enough to warrant further testing, and Daniel listened with folded arms and a tight jaw, insisting this was unnecessary, that coincidences existed, that not everything required digging, because digging implied something buried. And Beatrice agreed too quickly, her voice sharp as she reminded everyone that staff and boundaries mattered, but the doctors did not retreat, because science did not care about pride or hierarchy, and they explained that a DNA test would rule out genetic complications and protect Daniel's life, and the word protect carried weight, enough to force his reluctant consent, and Amora was summoned again, standing under bright hospital lights feeling smaller than ever as consent forms were placed in front of her name written plainly as if it hadn't been ignored for years, and she hesitated only once before signing, because deep down she had been waiting for this moment without admitting to herself, and when the samples were taken the silence between them became unbearable, Daniel avoiding her eyes, Beatrice watching her like an enemy, and Amora staring at the wall trying not to remember her mother's voice, and the days that followed were torture, filled with forced normalcy and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, and every night she wondered if the truth would free her or destroy what little stability she had left, because either way nothing would remain the same once the results came back. The doctor asked them to sit down before speaking, a simple gesture that instantly turned fear into certainty, because people only asked you to sit when your life was about to split in two, and Daniel felt his chest tighten as the words were spoken slowly and clearly, confirming that the DNA analysis showed a direct biological relationship, that Amora was his daughter beyond any doubt. And the room went silent in a way that swallowed sound itself, because denial had nowhere left to stand. And Beatrice was the first to react, rising abruptly and accusing Amora of manipulation and fraud, her voice cracking as years of carefully curated superiority shattered in seconds, but the doctor continued calmly, explaining timelines, probabilities, and evidence that could not be argued away. And Daniel felt something inside him collapse, not just shock but recognition, memories resurfacing of Lydia's face, her tears, the phone calls he ignored, the silence he chose because it was convenient, and he realized with crushing clarity that the girl he had humiliated, ignored, and reduced to nothing had been his child all along, and Amora stood frozen, tears spilling silently as the truth confirmed what she had feared her entire life, because knowing who her father was did not bring comfort or joy, only the unbearable weight of understanding how easily she had been erased, and as Daniel reached out instinctively she stepped back, because blood could explain origin but it could not erase years of absence. And in that moment everything Daniel believed about power, success, and control was ruined, because the greatest failure of his life was standing right in front of him in a maid's uniform he had never bothered to question. The night after the DNA result, Daniel Kingsley did not sleep, because sleep required peace, and peace was something he no longer deserved, and he sat alone in his study long after the house went quiet, staring at walls lined with achievements that suddenly felt meaningless, trophies of a life built on selective memory, and one by one he began opening drawers he had sealed years ago. Pulling out documents he convinced himself no longer mattered, old correspondence from hospitals, unopened letters, with Lydia's handwriting faded but still unmistakable, and as he read them slowly the years collapsed inward, taking him back to a time before power insulated him from consequences, to a young woman who believed his promises and trusted his words, who told him about the pregnancy with fear and hope mixed together, and who watched those emotions die when he chose silence instead of responsibility. And the realization hit him with brutal clarity that Lydia had not vanished mysteriously as he once told himself, but had been erased deliberately from his life because acknowledging her would have required sacrifice. And when he traced the dates on the medical records, his hand began to shake because they aligned perfectly with Amora's age, meaning every year he celebrated success she had been growing up without him, every promotion coinciding with another childhood moment he abandoned. And when he finally found the death certificate, his chest tightened painfully because Lydia had died poor and alone while he lived in excess. And in that moment Daniel understood that the DNA test had not ruined his life. It had only exposed the rot beneath the image he spent decades protecting. By morning, the truth had poisoned the atmosphere of the mansion, turning familiar hallways into hostile territory, and Amora felt it immediately as she stepped out of the staff quarters, sensing eyes following her movements, conversations stopping mid-sentence, and expressions changing when she entered rooms, because knowledge had transformed her from invisible to inconvenient. And Beatrice wasted no time asserting her rage, openly accusing Amora of deceit and manipulation, telling anyone who would listen that the girl had planned this outcome from the beginning, that she had infiltrated the house under false pretenses, and though Daniel attempted to intervene, his words carried little weight, because authority weakens when it is exposed as morally hollow, and staff members became divided. Some treating Amora with exaggerated politeness born of fear, others with resentment fueled by loyalty to Beatrice. And Amora found herself isolated again, but in a coolly ironic way, because now her existence demanded recognition she never sought, and each step through the mansion felt heavier as she realized that blood did not grant belonging, it only complicated rejection. And when Beatrice ordered her to stay out of certain areas and threatened dismissal despite the truth, Daniel said nothing, and that silence hurt more than shouting because it confirmed what Amora had feared all along. That acknowledgement did not automatically come with protection, and she began to understand that truth could expose injustice without correcting it. Daniel's apology did not arrive dramatically or publicly. It came late one evening when the house was quiet again, and even Beatrice had retreated into cold silence, and he stood awkwardly in front of Amora without authority or confidence, stripped of the voice that once commanded rooms. And for the first time he spoke without pride, admitting that he had chosen ambition over humanity, that he had seen people like her as background because it allowed him to avoid confronting his past, and that he had dismissed Lydia not because he doubted her truth, but because acknowledging it would have demanded responsibility he did not want. And as he spoke, Amora listened without interrupting, her expression steady, because she had imagined this conversation in countless ways, and none of them prepared her for how hollow apologies sounded after decades of absence. And when Daniel finally asked for forgiveness, his voice broke, not from entitlement but from realization, and Amora answered calmly that forgiveness was not a transaction, and reconciliation was not guaranteed. That while he had just discovered a daughter, she had lived 20 years learning how to survive without a father, and that the pain he felt now was only a fraction of what silence had cost her growing up, and her words cut deeply because they were not spoken in anger but in truth, forcing Daniel to understand that while the DNA test connected them biologically, it did not rewrite history. And as he walked away carrying shame instead of authority, Amora sat alone, realizing that the truth had freed her name but placed the burden of choice squarely on her shoulders, because from this moment on she would decide what kind of future she allowed this truth to shape. Amora did not wake up the next morning as a different person, because transformation does not arrive overnight, but something inside her had shifted irreversibly, and for the first time she moved through the house without shrinking, without lowering her eyes out of habit, because the truth had taken away her fear of being seen. And though whispers followed her, she no longer adjusted herself to them, choosing instead to exist fully in spaces she had once tried to disappear from. And this subtle change unsettled everyone more than anger would have, because silence paired with confidence carries a weight that cannot be easily dismissed, and Amora began asserting boundaries in small but deliberate ways, refusing unreasonable commands, correcting misinformation calmly, and speaking with a clarity that revealed years of hidden intelligence. And Daniel noticed this transformation with a mix of pride and regret, realizing too late that the strength he admired now had been forged without him, while Beatrice watched it with growing alarm, because Amora's refusal to remain small threatened the fragile control Beatrice had maintained over the household. And when Amora informed Daniel that she intended to resume her education using her own savings rather than relying on him, the decision stunned him more than any accusation could have, because it made clear that she was not seeking compensation or validation, only autonomy. And in that moment Daniel understood that she was no longer asking to be recognized. She was claiming herself. Beatrice did not lose control quietly, because women like her rarely do, and when it became clear that Amora would not retreat or disappear, she shifted from hostility to strategy, consulting lawyers under the guise of protecting the family name, framing the situation as an attempted fraud by a former employee, and filing claims that accused Amora of falsifying identity and manipulating medical results. And the shock of legal documents arriving shattered any illusion that the truth alone could protect Amora, because suddenly her life was being dissected publicly, her past scrutinized, and her intentions questioned by people who had never known her, and Daniel found himself paralyzed between loyalty to his wife and responsibility to his daughter, a hesitation that spoke louder than words, while Beatrice used every connection she had to influence narratives, spreading rumors that painted Amora as opportunistic and calculating, and Amora felt the weight of injustice pressed down on her. Again, realizing that truth does not always travel faster than lies, but this time she did not retreat into silence, instead gathering evidence patiently, document her mother had preserved, witnesses who remembered Lydia, and records that money could not erase, because survival had taught her that endurance paired with preparation was stronger than outrage. And as the legal battle intensified, she understood that this fight was no longer just about identity, but about dignity. The courtroom became the place where power was stripped of performance and reduced to facts, and as proceedings unfolded, Beatrice's confidence began to fracture under scrutiny, because the evidence Amora presented was not emotional but meticulous, medical records that matched timelines, letters written long before Amora ever stepped into the Kingsley mansion, witnesses who spoke of Lydia's pregnancy and abandonment without bitterness but with quiet certainty, and Daniel sat through it all, feeling exposed in a way no public scandal had ever achieved, because this was not about business failure but moral reckoning. And when the judge dismissed Beatrice's claims and ruled decisively in Amora's favor, the silence that followed was heavier than any verdict, because it confirmed publicly what Daniel had only begun to accept privately, that his past choices had consequences that money could not shield him from. And as Beatrice's composure finally broke, the image she had built collapsed. With it, leaving behind a woman forced to confront the limits of control, and Amora walked out of the courtroom not triumphant but resolved, because victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like closure, and for the first time she understood that she had reclaimed not just her name but her narrative, choosing to stand in truth even when it cost her comfort. The fallout did not wait politely for time to pass, because scandals rooted in truth move faster than those built on rumor, and Daniel Kingsley watched the world he once controlled begin to pull away from him piece by piece, business partners growing cautious, invitations quietly withdrawn, whispers following his name in rooms where he once commanded respect, and for the first time he could not buy silence or redirect attention, because the story was too human, too morally charged, powerful. Man exposed not for financial crime but for personal failure, and that cut deeper than any allegation of corruption ever could, and Daniel felt the humiliation settle into his bones as headlines reframed his success through the lens of abandonment, forcing him to confront how fragile reputation truly was when stripped of narrative control, and unlike before he did not fight it, because somewhere along the way shame had replaced pride, and he began canceling appearances, withdrawing from public life, and sitting alone in spaces once filled with applause, realizing that the image he lost was never as solid as he believed, while Amora watched this unraveling from a distance without satisfaction or bitterness, understanding that accountability was not revenge, it was consequence, and though Daniel attempted to reach out more frequently, inviting conversation, asking questions about her life, she responded cautiously, because trust does not grow simply because guilt appears, and she needed time to separate the man who failed her from the father he was now trying to become. Daniel's attempts at connection were awkward and restrained, stripped of entitlement but heavy with uncertainty, because he was learning something he had never practiced before, presence without control, and instead of offering money or solutions, he began showing up quietly, attending meetings he was not required to, listening without interruption, and accepting silence when it came. And Amora noticed these efforts not as gestures but as patterns, understanding that consistency revealed more than words ever could, and slowly she allowed space for cautious interaction, short conversations that avoided the past, shared meals that felt unfamiliar, and moments where Daniel learned simple truths about her, that she loved medicine because it made sense of chaos, that she valued routine because instability had shaped her childhood, and that she feared dependence more than failure. And Daniel absorbed these details with a mixture of awe and grief, realizing that knowing her now did not recover the years he missed, but it did force him to confront the depth of that loss. And while the relationship remained fragile, something shifted, not into closeness but into recognition, the understanding that fatherhood was not a title granted by DNA but a responsibility earned through patience, humility, and time. Beatrice's departure was not dramatic, because pride rarely allows spectacle when defeat is undeniable, and one morning her absence was simply felt rather than announced, rooms emptier, tension lifted, her authority dissolving into silence, and the staff moved cautiously at first, uncertain how to recalibrate in a house no longer governed by fear, and Amora felt the change most acutely, because for the first time the space did not resist a presence, and though the mansion remained physically the same, it no longer felt like a battlefield. And Daniel moved through it quietly, no longer issuing command but observing, reflecting, and accepting that leadership without empathy had hollowed the very structure he once ruled. And as Beatrice's influence faded, Amora made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself, choosing not to stay in the mansion permanently but to move into her own modest apartment closer to school, asserting independence not as rejection but as self. definition, and Daniel respected this boundary without argument, understanding that proximity did not equal healing. And as Amora packed her belongings, she paused in the doorway one last time, realizing that the house that once reduced her to nothing had become the place where she reclaimed her voice. And though she left without ceremony, she carried with her a quiet certainty that her future would no longer be shaped by invisibility or resentment, but by choice. Amora's decision did not come from anger or rebellion, but from clarity, the kind that settles quietly after storms pass. And as she stood in line at the registry office holding documents that carried the weight of her entire life, she felt something she had never felt before: control. Because for the first time, she was not reacting to abandonment or cruelty or discovery. She was choosing deliberately. And when asked what surname she wished to officially bear, she did not hesitate, refusing the Kingsley name without bitterness, and choosing instead to keep her mother's. The woman who carried her alone, raised her with dignity despite scarcity, and loved her without condition. And this choice surprised many people who assumed acknowledgement automatically meant inheritance. But Amora understood something they didn't: that identity was not something handed down by power, but something earned through survival. And when Daniel learned of her decision, he felt both pain and respect, because he finally understood that claiming her now did not erase the years Lydia had stood alone, and instead of arguing or persuading, he accepted it silently, realizing that honoring Amora meant honoring her autonomy, not reshaping her into something that eased his conscience. And as Amora walked out of that office with papers that reflected her truth, she felt lighter. Not because the past was gone, but because it no longer defined the boundaries of her future. The day of Amora's graduation arrived without spectacle, held in a modest auditorium filled with families celebrating victories both large and small, and Daniel arrived quietly, sitting near the back without announcing himself, because for once he did not want recognition. He only wanted to witness. And as Amora's name was called, she walked across the stage with steady confidence, no uniform, no bowed head, no fear of being unseen. And the applause that followed was not thunderous but sincere. And Daniel felt tears sting his eyes as he realized this moment existed despite him, not because of him. And when the ceremony ended, he waited patiently, unsure whether she would acknowledge him at all. And when Amora finally approached him, their exchange was simple, respectful, restrained, because some wounds heal slowly and some scars remain as reminders rather than punishments. And as Daniel watched her walk away, surrounded by people who knew her not as a maid or a mistake, but as a woman who earned her place, he understood fully and painfully that the DNA test did not ruin his life. It revealed it, exposing the cost of pride, the damage of silence, and the truth that the greatest losses are not measured in money or reputation, but in moments you can never reclaim. And as the story closes, the words linger heavy and undeniable, because he thought she was just a maid, until the truth stood in front of him and ruined everything he believed about power, worth, and what it truly means to be a father.